Welcome to Commonwealth Works, where today we'll be discussing a classical definition of socialism and how it differs from other ideas and that it's often conflated with in the political discourse in the United States. So we'll start by defining socialism in its classical sense, then go over the classical foundations for where the idea of socialism comes from, especially Marx and Engels. We'll discuss how socializing industries works in practice, and then we'll distinguish from classical socialism, how it's different than related concepts. Public or state ownership of the means of production is the core tenet of socialism. This means that everything that is used for manufacturing, including factories, land, capital, meaning the machinery or other plant or equipment used for production, transportation, energy, and mining are owned by the state. So this is very different than regulations or welfare, in that this is the state owning and controlling how business is done in the country by administering that business directly. This is very different than regulations, which say what a company can't do or is required to do to do business. Now, regulation can reach a level where it can become equivalent of state ownership, and in that's something that needs to be adjudicated. But normal levels of regulation are not socialism because the property is still owned by individuals or private entities. Welfare is also fundamentally different because it's not about ownership. It doesn't matter who owns it under a welfare policy. A welfare policy captures some of the wealth that's generated from production in the form of taxes and then redistributes those taxes to ensure that a minimum level of well-being is available to all members of society. These are very different than socialism because socialism is, again, that state ownership and direct control of the economy versus regulation making sure that the private actors don't run wild in the economy, or welfare making sure that people aren't left behind from economic activity within the economy. So those would be how the regulation and welfare are fundamentally very different than that state ownership. Marx and Engels thought that collectivism, socialism, was necessary to correct the problems with capitalism. The problems with capitalism included the business cycle, where you have a boom and bust cycle, where the economy grows rapidly, creating a lot of wealth, and then busts, destroying a lot of wealth and causing a lot of hardship. They also believed that this system was inherently irrational and counterproductive, meaning that lots of investments would be made in not socially necessary goods, and a rationalized scientific system could be developed to plan the economy collectively and therefore more efficiently. Now, we've discovered over time, and the Austrian school has developed, that having the information to make those decisions rationally from a centrally planned economy is very difficult, if not impossible, because gathering the information about preferences and collecting the information from all the various sources at a level of quality that's necessary to make those calculations may not be possible. And we use the market mechanism to make those calculations. But Marx and Engels were making these claims before that was established. It can be easy to attack Marx and Engels as being uh, foolish because their ideas were not proven, but also the other people had to argue with why their ideas wouldn't work. And the world at the time that they lived was changing very rapidly, and it was creating a lot of social harm at the time. So it's easy to poo-poo them. There's lots of things I think were fundamentally very easy to see as wrong at the time, like their rabid atheism and radical secularism, but their economic ideas, it can be seen as much more reasonable than we might think looking back at them now. So under the Marxist system, there's the idea that there's no private property. All property is publicly owned. This means that it's either owned by state-run collectives or just the state directly. This theoretically could lead to empowerment of the workers. Now, the problem arises for how do you manage these state-run enterprises without replicating the same problems that occurred under the bourgeoisie and capitalism. This is something that happens very rapidly, is that hierarchies develop even in systems that are directly designed to eliminate hierarchies. So you end up with state managers replacing the bourgeoisie managers, and prestige going to those state managers and state privileges. You can see how this is fundamentally different than reformist approaches, where programs like welfare attempt to alleviate the problems created by capitalism, or programs like regulation attempt to curb the excesses of capitalism. This is in socialism. The idea is you just eliminate capitalism and create a centrally planned economy that creates the general welfare. Nationalization is the process by which the state takes control of private industries. So this is actually something that comes up in a modern context, not directly in a communist system, where you have a flagging industry nationally, and that industry is taken over by the government in order to maybe just to be a caretaker, or maybe the industry is determined to be vitally necessary to the national welfare, but not economically sustainable. So the government nationalizes the industry and then subsidizes it to keep it going. This might be in things like state railways. This has happened quite a lot, where things are nationalized, denationalized in a caretaker role, or other vital industries might be semi-nationalized with state investment to prop them up or get them through a tough time. You might say that this is something that might be closer to where the United States has had a explicitly socialist policy, might be like the automotive or bank bailouts we had during the 2008 crisis. I think calling them socialism does come close to nationalization, the way the bailouts were administered, especially when stock ownership was directly purchased. In Germany, there's companies that are public companies that have private ownership, but they also have a significant amount of public ownership, where a German state, for instance, owns a large portion of Volkswagen. I think that calling that socialism is closer to the classical definition of socialism. It's not exactly socialism, it's sort of a hybrid, but that is hybrid socialism, unlike welfare or a situation where you would have welfare or regulation. That's it's fundamentally a different idea if we're talking about those ideas of socialism and nationalization. In a communist context, the nationalization would usually just be the seizure. In a more capitalist country, nationalization, or a more capitalist or a more free market, free trade, or common law tradition, the nationalization would generally be administered by a purchase of the company, so that the private individual would still end up with wealth. They would just no longer have the control of capital. The combination of a welfare state and regulation are what we call social democracy. The combination of those factors as with capitalism. This is definitively different than socialism, as we've demonstrated previously. In the political debate, especially in the United States, social democratic programs like welfare, Social Security, and Medicare are often called socialism. This is unhelpful for them because these programs are social democratic programs. Uh, there are certain examples where other nations, certain welfare programs in other nations, you could call socialized, or you could call them some form of socialism. That would be a system where, for instance, the healthcare system is directly administered by the state, where doctors and nurses are state employees. The hospital building is owned by the state. That what you could call directly socialism. But most of other capitalist countries that have strong universal healthcare do have some sort of private industry within that system. So it's even rare for that particular to be fully socialist. It tends to still be social democratic. Um, so there are very few examples where we could say that we have socialism in the countries that are generally regarded as capitalist. The level and cost of the social welfare programs varies, and you could say that that's just how social democratic versus rawly capitalist they are. So the United States tends to be interpreted as on on the more capitalist end of the perspective, the more capitalist end of the spectrum, and some European countries would be on the more social democratic end of the spectrum. But it's rare that any country that's in the Western world is meaningfully socialist, with the exception of occasionally healthcare. Regulations, for the most part, are not socialism. Processes like antitrust laws that ensure competition and the effective operation of the free market, as well as environmental regulations or labor regulations that prevent harms, do not prevent a business owner from effective control and exercising their property. uh, Regulations can grow to the point where there's no freedom to operate for a business, and then you could call that indirect socialism. But I think it's pretty rare that that has happened. That has occasionally happened in some industries, but it's quite rare. And we should not make a tempest in a teapot out of regulations for the most part in most countries in the Western world. There may be some developing countries that have more overbearing regulations that prevent someone from exercising their property rights, but that also still doesn't make it socialism. That could just be a different type of taking or just straight up corruption. Workers' cooperatives are not socialism unless they are owned by the state and created by the state. Uh, Otherwise, they are still private free market enterprises. If the cooperative is created by the workers and owned by the workers, that's fundamentally not state ownership, that's worker ownership. Sum things up. Socialism is a system in which the state owns the means of production. Regulations and welfare programs do not make socialism. State ownership attempts to ensure that there's a fair distribution of resources and maximize collective welfare. State ownership is definitively different from a mixed economy or social democracy. Thank you for joining me in Commonwealth Works. Please hit that like or subscribe button, and thank you for tuning in.